Hello, and welcome to the FluCoMa podcast. So in this episode, I'm talking with Simon Smith, who is currently the studio technician at the Birmingham Electroacoustic Sound Theatre, better known as BEAST. So Simon is experienced in acousmatic music and its diffusion. In 2016, he obtained an MA from De Montfort University for his research on the listening to acousmatic music in the concert hall. And with BEAST, he supervises a setup of up to 100 loudspeakers that's been used all over the world and at various events, such as the Sound Theatre's own new music festival, BeastFest. So Simon is also a musician and creative coder. His practice takes many forms, from installations to solo performances to alternative DJing to participating in groups such as John Richard's Dirty Electronics. For many years, Simon has been part of the Kyma community and has bridged between Kyma and bespoke pieces of hardware like EMG bracelets using Macs. So Simon has recently been using some of the FluCoMa tools, and he has kindly accepted to come and talk about some of his experiences today. So Simon, hello and welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. Hello.
So perhaps you could start by telling us a little bit about how you got into the world of electronic music.
Well, thank you for inviting me. Thank you for having me. As many probably men of my age, I think I got into this just by playing around on keyboards when I was about 14 years old with aspirations to be either Depeche Mode or Jean-Michel Jarre, which is quite sad retrospectively, but there we are, it's out there now. So I got into kind of just like home keyboards, and then got my first synthesizer and MIDI sequencer. And then when I was about 17, I had a friend and she introduced me to Stockhausen, or she was being taught Stockhausen at university. And I was really intrigued by this very different music, and she introduced me to Cage as well. And I went to, shortly after that, I think I went to Bristol Library on a whim, and I got two books out. I think one was John Chowning's DX7 programming book. Why I thought I needed that, I don't know. And the other one, very presciently, was Simon Emerson's book, The Language of Electroacoustic Music. And this one seemed to, I had not probably a clue what any of it was, but I read the book from cover to cover, and it seemed to point me towards a music based on sound, not based on notes, that was my whole understanding of music. Music is notes and pitches and that kind of thing. And I always felt we didn't have a great music class at school. And so this notion that I could make music or make some kind of sound that wasn't based on that structure made me, just really filled me with excitement. And also I was kind of growing up in an era of kind of hardcore rave and early acid, and that sort of music was very sort of hands-on, very kind of just working with machines. And I think that kind of gave me a bit of oomph to go and do my own thing. And we did that for a few years. And then I think it wasn't until 2001, another friend of mine was at Middlesex University and said, there's a sonic art course here. And sonic art seemed to me like it was something I could do. It was accessible to me. And I, the books I'd read, the things that I was interested in all seemed to point towards this course. And so I started a degree in sonic art, which was a great mix of electroacoustic music, installation art, sound synthesis, sound theory as well. And I studied with John Dack, Salome Vogelin, and Martin Robinson, and the late Hugh Davis, which was, it was a wonderful time to kind of be there with those people. And really, I think I'd say it's the blueprint for all my endeavors afterwards, but I'm still stuck in sort of moving between all of those different areas. And strangely enough, after that, I mean, I'd been working in care work for 10 years at this point. I got a job at the University of Manchester as a technician. And from then on, I was kind of closely involved with electroacoustic composers, performers, artists, anyone who came through. And my career has been sort of being a technician there, and a couple of other universities as well. And I got to meet and work with Pauline Oliveros, work with Merzbauer, work with Keith Rowe, Francis Dumont, so many people. I mean, that's a really short list. But and what was great about that was every day I was learning something new. Every day I'd get a different perspective, a different challenge, and it was fascinating. I mean, some really passionate, dedicated people came through, and I got to just see how they worked, and it's been fantastic.
It must be a really interesting job, working as a technician with all those people. It must be great. And it's interesting that you talk about that kind of point where that kind of revelation of music as sound rather than notes, because I remember very strongly that happened to me as well. And it had to be kind of given to me. It wasn't something that I sort of initially found on my own. It wasn't until like my third year of university that I had a pure data class, and kind of realizing that music can be kind of configured around sound, and it can be something other than notes and stuff like that. It's an odd way of working. I mean, like when you kind of read a bit, I mean, I'm not like an expert on Schaffer, but that you read sort of Schaffer, his when he's trying to work that out for himself, how do I deal with this sound? And without getting deeply theoretical on whether it's sound as material or whether it's a particularly technological sound. If we just take it as sound, it's a very different way into creating, and it's funny that all the sort of points in around Schaffer, like worldwide, kind of it was a real moment that as an idea could take off. I mean, like Cage and Varese kind of talking about music in very different ways to what had come before. It's been liberating but equally frustrating. Yes, and it's still, obviously, when you grow up, still, even in music and going to music schools and stuff, you still grow up with this idea of music as notes and as this abstract structure.
I do.
Yeah. So I think an interesting way of getting to know your approach also would be perhaps to quickly learn about your research, which was entitled An Exploration of Listening to Acousmatic Music in the Concert Hall. So it sounds really interesting. I was wondering if you could give us a quick overview of the research and explain how it might relate to the way that you make music.
Yeah, I think I don't know who's listening to this, so I'll do a quick rewind on what sort of acousmatic music is. Well, it's not a complete thing on what acousmatic music, but it's about what acousmatic music performance is, and I think that's the important bit, really. And it's at its very basic starting point, it was about putting sound through multiple loudspeakers, rather than putting it over two big speakers. So if you go to a pop concert, well, actually pop concerts are lots of little loudspeakers now, but they're just arranged left and right, and they're loud, and they're meant to be loud. Acousmatic music is performed to have loudspeakers around you, and also for loudspeakers to have, particularly in the early days, to be like an instrument. So you might have like a bass speaker or a solo speaker or an arrangement of particular speakers that give a particular quality of sound. So that's the sort of the old kind of GRM approach. And so what you're doing is, for say stereo diffusion, is you're sending all the left channel to all the left-sided speakers, all the right channel to all the right-sounded loudspeakers, and you're controlling the volume. And it's deathly simple in how you can create spatial motion from a piece of music just by adjusting the level of each of the loudspeakers, so you can move it from front to back and around in a very performative, very kind of visceral kind of way. And this is sort of before Dolby Atmos, still, and ambisonics. And so this practice has quite a long history, particularly obviously in France, and latterly in the UK. That different people have different approaches to spatialization, but that's kind of the area that I sort of work in. So my role as a technician is just to refine the placement of those loudspeakers and to choose them according to the kind of repertoire that would be in a concert. And I think what I found is, being a concert maker and less a composer, so I diffused more pieces than I've composed, is that every week we would do things slightly differently. There wasn't a set and forget kind of system. You'd have certain things that would be set, but you would tweak different things for different people. And I found that there was a disparity between that practice of concert creation and the very kind of formal academic language that was used for not for diffusion. Well, yeah, for diffusion and for what diffusion is. The discourse was very composer-led. It was very formal. It was very idealized. It was very out of time, and it was very problem-focused. So it was like you'll often hear people sort of say, "Well, diffusion came about because it was answering the problem of how do you play music with no instruments over loudspeakers in a concert hall." And I think that really devalues what the practice is. It's much more than that. It's actually an extension of the composition. It's an extension of making music for people to listen to and for audiences to be in. So for me, the practice was very aesthetic. It was a very aesthetic kind of thing. It was very contingent. It was very dynamic because it would change. But it was very pragmatic because you had the room, you had the loudspeakers that you had, and it was about finding as many choices as you could within that. So that kind of developed a mini manifesto for me of what the practice of concert creation was, and the research was just interviewing actually a lot of composers and sort of picking at what they said in different situations. Sort of when asked a formal question, they'd respond very formally, and when you say yes, but that was a beautiful piece, and then suddenly that all evaporates and they take on a very different language, different approach. And so whilst I was at DMU, together with then PhD students, Andrew Hill and Mike Gatt, we formed Hear This Space. And Hear This Space was an organisation that wanted to put those concerts on outside of an academic context. And also to sort of re-inject the experimental into that practice. It's still a very formalised practice, and I still think there's so much that you can explore. Sorry, I could go on about this for ages, but like you can explore with non-standard loudspeakers and non-standard placement of loudspeakers, deliberately coloured speakers, but also using really good technology as well to have contrast, to create something unique. And I think we worked with non-specialists as well as established composers, and that meeting was important as well. And we coined the term sort of site sensitive sound, which was to curate from the place, not from the piece. So you would curate, you'd have a place that you were going to do a concert at. You'd curate the loudspeakers. You'd create the pieces that fitted and resonated with that place. And so we were talking about an event, an event for people to be in, to get submerged in. And I suppose it's about making, maybe another way of putting it is, a lot of concert halls, a lot of loudspeaker systems should be transparent. And you're there to solely focus on the music that's being presented to you. So all of that kind of melts away. And I think for me, it wasn't the opposite of that. It was just acknowledging that the loudspeaker system and the room and the setting and the placement of all of that is part of the process for you to absorb yourself in the piece of music. It's actually it just feels like a missed opportunity, I guess. So yeah.
It's really interesting because, I mean, obviously it's a really deep subject, and I mean, my little experience of that is with the Hiss at Huddersfield, which I helped set up a few times for Electric Spring, but obviously it was always in the same space, always in Phipps Hall, first floor of the music building, and so it was quite a systematic. I think the 2 or 3 years that I did, it was more or less the same setup and stuff. But I do know that it's gone on the road to various other places, and there must be a whole kind of level of reflection around taking a setup like that to a different space, and and even the different kinds of speakers. Yes, I remember people who are much more knowledgeable about speakers and things than me talking about a certain speaker being useful for reverb that you place in a certain part of the room, and that kind of stuff. No, it's really interesting.
It's a real practice, and I think that part. I think I was talking to John T informally many years ago, maybe when I was doing this, and I was like, it feels like the notion of experimentation with that, or that practice, has gone. And I asked him when it happened, and he said when we got rooms, because previously they didn't have a concert hall for themselves, and a lot of places now have they either have a set place where they go to, or they have a pre-configured sort of black box room, and it's done and it's fixed. I mean, it's not to say that that's the only answer, but it's when it's that against booking constraints and time constraints of how long you've got to get in and set up, it's all very time consuming. So it just gets withered away. It just gets, refined down, which is completely understandable. But it was something that for me was a sad thing to sort of say goodbye to, I guess. Yeah,
it's a really interesting perspective. Yeah, cool. So I'm also curious to know about your approach to musicking with other people. So I mentioned at the beginning that you've played John Richard's Dirty Electronics, which is obviously something that's very live and immediate. But you've also worked, so you mentioned the Hear This Space project, which was allowing people who aren't necessarily from the world of new music to be able to create things, and which is obviously a very different kind of relationship. So I was wondering if you could talk about your approach to working and performing with others from different worlds that they may come from in a musical way.
Yeah. I mean, actually, my work with Hear This Space was so influenced by John Richards. John would do workshops with people and build little instruments together and then perform together. And it was, I felt like that was a really, that was very much a blueprint for just how I wanted to work with other people. And also for me, I'm still in sort of a facilitator kind of mode in that sense. And we did with Hear This Space, we we got some Arts Council funding. Andrew applied for some Arts Council funding, and we were able to do workshops at 3 or 4 places across the country, in Barrow-in-Furness and in Leicester, and somewhere else as well, I can't remember. And then and what we did is we just put an open invite to people who might be interested in working with sound. And the plan is we invite people to work with sound, and then they can create a piece, and then we can put on a concert. So I suppose maybe in a way I kind of reflected my own sort of way into this practice, which was we tried to be as we gave people access to the tools. So we did some sound walks, we did some listening sessions, we sat around with our computers and did some basic introduction on how to sort of edit, and nothing too heavy, but just so that they could feel their way around. And we showed them some other examples of pieces. But I think what was important about that is we showed them the music, but also why the people had made the music that they'd made. So it was about, so that people didn't feel like they had to do the same thing, but that they understood that people go through a process of sort of working with sound material, working with recorded sound, and how their listening kind of changed as a consequence of being in the world, and then putting headphones on and listening through a microphone, and then recording that, and then out of time. And that kind of process was really good. And I think the one that still sticks out for me today was we had these 2 girls who came along with their mums, and we did the sound walks, and we gave them a little recorder, and they had that for a couple of weeks, and they took it home. They knew their way around the software, I think. Well, they learned it as they did. And the 2 girls had gone round, it was at Leicester Museum, and they'd gone round and they banged on all the walls, which is like not the thing you do in a very sort of, in a museum. But we had the run of the museum for this workshop. So they went around and they banged on all the walls, and they all had a kind of different sound. And then they came back and they found that they could increase the gain massively, and then they could clip and distort this sound. But then they sort of cut up all these bangs, put them together, and they made the most fantastic noise piece. It was brilliant. I mean, it was a really, really good piece, and that's not in any way condescending. It was just good. It was just absolutely brilliant. And it was noisy, but it was playful as well. And they diffused it in the museum, and they weren't really interested. It was very funny. And so they kind of casually just poking at the fader, and it would pop up here and it would pop up there. And it was brilliant. It was so good. I kind of wonder where they are now. I hope they're doing something. But yeah, I think that was like a real, I think that made me, we worked with lots of other great people as well, I have to say, during those periods, and we got to make some friends out of it as well, and it built a nice little kind of community. But I think sort of that my role in that was, and my role as a technician, I'm kind of used to being, I'm facilitating, I'm enabling people to try and get the best of what I can. So my practice of musicking is actually a step back from from making sort of sound or making music in that sense. But then me as a performer is a different relationship, and it's still very much negotiation, but it's like when I work with Dirty Electronics, even John would shape the piece, he would conduct the piece, and so your role was to play the right thing at the right moment, as best you can, and he makes very sort of noisy aleatoric kind of instruments, which are wonderful and really expressive and very musical in a very broad kind of way. It really made me think about gesture and timing as very important kind of things. Less, there's no way to control pitch you've got dynamics and you've got time. And I think that he's brilliant at putting that together to make music. And I suppose that carries over then into my music making. When I'm improvising now with people, I think I build similar systems that aren't so based, they're not pitch based, they're very noisy, but it's about timing, texture, and dynamics, I think. And I think that for me is like my way into sort of improvising with people or making music with people. Compositionally, it's a whole nother thing. But yeah, certainly in terms of the performances I've done, that's where it's at.
Yeah, it was interesting hearing you talk about that workshop you did, because so in the FluCoMa project, obviously one of the initial concerns I know for the development team was to try and make sure that the tools aren't like these kind of black boxes that tell you how to do something. But then again, my colleague James Bradbury is currently in Australia doing a workshop. I can't remember where exactly, but that's around the theme of field recordings, and rather than just sort of introducing the FluCoMa tools or machine learning in music, it's around a certain activity which could kind of be pushing people into using them a certain way, but it's also something that I think is probably going to engage people, especially people who might not be quite so technically savvy about things. I think that's a really good way of...
Oh no, it's massively important. I mean, language and discourse, I'm very, very, very sensitive to that, because it's how you present something. Like, but everyone's kind of, there's so many sort of preconceptions particularly about what we do and the way that we talk about it. Like, that's my biggest thing of being a technician, is translation. Yes, it's all the technology and it's about understanding that's true. But a lot of it is translation. It's being able to translate something that is something technical, like maybe deeply technical, to something that is aesthetic, without one, it's wasted. And I think, I mean, it's interesting you guys are doing those workshops, because I think they're really important. I think they're massively important, because it changes. Just to be hands-on with other people is another way of being with interesting ideas, I think, as well. Yeah.
So over the course of your career, you've created many forms of music, which you've mentioned. So you've got live performance, diffusion, installations, all that kind of stuff. So I was just wondering if, sort of taking a broad overview, if there are any recurring themes across those different forms, if there were similar approaches to the way you...
I think it was funny, because I think when I was thinking about this question, I was just like, no, there isn't. It's like, it's really disparate. But I think some of the things that we've talked about sort of up to now, actually, there's the theme would be sound, and the way that I view sound. I'm more of a sound maker than I'm a music maker, and I'm not. That whole debate of whether something's music or whether it's sonic art or whether it's sound is problematic in an academic sense, but in a practical sense, it's not. It's very fluid. I think there's bits of sound art that are music, and there are bits of music that are sound art, and that they flow between each other, and it's that's really important. So I mean, like, I do feel like a bit of a dilettante with a lot of what I do. I mean, I have done now lots of different things, but maybe I'm just slow at working out what I want to do. I think, I mean, I started off, the two left ears stuff, which is DJing outside of music, was kind of a response to the more pompous aspects of academia and electroacoustic music. And to interject those little performances in between quite serious things was always quite fun, and light relief. But I think there's always been an aspect of humor and Dada and what I do. There were aspects in my installations as well that were about that. And also, I think I think I've always felt like maybe I wanted to bring humor into a lot of what I do, and it's. I mean, it came. I think I did a piece of music, which I then turned into a performance for a Kyma conference in Oslo, where I made a piece of sort of acousmatic, electroacoustic music, work with Kyma, played it, but then halfway through interjected with a breakdown of the audience listening services, which was this company that I'd made up in my head, and that the audience there were part of audience listening services. But I basically sacked them and replaced them with machine learning and basically outsourced listening responses to cheaper countries where I could get it, cheaper and stuff like this. And each of them had a little letter saying that their jobs were being reevaluated, and basically sacked them. And it really was quite a response from people. Like, there were some people were actually horrified. Some people, it really triggered them because they've been through it with work. And I think that's just like taking sort of artificial listening, machine listening, and just making something playful, making something dark maybe out of it. But sort of my kind of, I've tried to be a composer, and I think maybe some of my elective mute stuff is about that. But that was also about, like, I just spend ages making sounds on my computer, almost to the point where I can do it in my sleep, and I'm processing. I made hard drives full of sound, but I wasn't making anything with them. They were all very inspirational to me, but they weren't going out. So I think I just tried to start making some stuff with that. And it's probably my least developed thing that I do, but I've got some great people who offer me help and advice, and John Wall's been really good, and Brona, my partner, has been really good. Making compositions is far harder for me. But I think that when I saw the Mayo armband, that felt like I turned a corner, because I could take all my sound material and I could interact with it really, really directly. And also the way that I could realize that, like, I use odd speaker configurations as my loudspeaker. I do just go through a PA sometimes, but I like the idea of being able to perform with maybe other musicians or other sound makers, but have the loudspeaker that I've designed as an extension of me, kind of thing. So and there's so much with the armbands that I think that I want to do, that there's a lot of mileage there for me now. So that feels like the moment that a few of those things come together, and periodically they come together. But as general themes, I think it's working with sound, aspects of humor, aspects of trying to move beyond just, or to work with sound in a context that is that I'm in control of. I still see there's still a bit of installation art there, that is, the performances can be more global than just, making sound, kind of thing.
Yeah, that's great. Well, I'd like to start discussing some of the technical sides of your creative process, because you talked about the armbands. I think one important thing perhaps to start with would be to talk about Kyma, and I'm glad that I was pronouncing that right.
Yes, it's all right. I used to pronounce it wrong to Kurt and Carla, who made it. I would say Kyma.
Yeah.
And they would say, no, it's Kyma, and I go, yes, that's what I said, Kyma. But I do start saying Kyma now. I'm better trained.
Yes. Well, so it's been a part of your practice for a long time, and you're an active member of its community, which I'll come back to later. But perhaps you could explain to me and the people listening exactly what Kyma is, because it's I mean, it's got quite a big following, but it's perhaps not known to everybody. So.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's fair to say that it's a niche following, but it's yeah. So I mean, basically, it's a sound design hardware and software created by Symbolic Sound, who are Carla Scaletti and Kurt Habel, and Encomia Gaffer, who's the admin person. And it's used extensively in Hollywood sound design, most notably I think the voice of Wally and Eva. If you ever watch the Ben Burt's sort of sound design things, you'll see little bits of Kyma there. But essentially, it's a software modular sound processor that runs on bespoke hardware. It's in the ballpark of kind of Max MSP, Super Collider, and Reactor. And I think for me, one of its many strengths is the quality of the sound processing algorithms, and the kind of ease with which you can try quite complex stuff. You know, you can try cross synthesis quite easily, and a lot of spectral morphing can be just done. And I think one of the things that kind of turned it for me was actually the way you can take a sound you've maybe patched together, and then you can say, right, generate me other patches based on this patch, and you can have what's called a gallery, and it just you end up with a lot of stuff to sift through and play with. So it's like a bit like maybe like a preset randomization, but in a very kind of complex way. But that works for me because I think it's something that unconsciously it's come up, is I learned through. I'm much more of a hacker than I am I'm going to start here and then I'm going to, you know, find my idea. I sift through things. I work basically more. I learn more from breaking things than I do from making things. So it's about, yeah, it's a sound design environment, but it's also very much a music environment as well. It's brilliant for live performance. It has a timeline that you can jump around. I think what's great about it is that yeah, I really like the sound quality of it, essentially.
And is that do you have to run it on the hardware?
Yes.
Yeah, it has to run on the hardware. And so does the sound quality come from the fact that you're able to create?
I mean, I think it's really the quality of Kurt and Carla's algorithms. There's some sort of design choices that they've made about how sound kind of resolves, and that just make it very straight sort of forward for doing certain things. You haven't got to think that extra level ahead. They've just designed things very well with sound quality in mind, I think. And it's very much I think when when it's maybe a larger company, or maybe even an open source project, you have so many different ways of doing the same thing, or so many different ways of coding an object or an oscillator, for example, that's you just, different people, different abilities come in. But these guys, when they design something, it's done very, very well. It's designed to be real time, immediate, and sound great, I think. And that's just a ground up thing that they've built over the years.
Yeah. And I remember you talked at one point in a chat we had before about the kind of aura that some of the creative coding environments can leave on the kind of sounds that you make. So between Max and Super Collider and Kyma, that there being that perhaps I, with my quite limited technical knowledge, sort of see it as this kind of unexplainable kind of trace that gets ingrained within the sound. But yeah, so is it that kind of?
That gets into very dodgy sort of hi-fi territory for me. It's like, that should we have? should we have gold-plated USB leads and things like that? No, I mean, I think it's not. It's not that one thing sounds. I think there's a point to which, so there are things that are very low level and very coded and baked in, and they're design choices, which sometimes echo out, sometimes don't. Some programs allow you to code right down to that level, so that kind of thing's mitigated. So if you want to code your own oscillator, then knock yourself out, and that, you can make those choices. It's just I think it's an affordance thing, but also like the level at which you work. Like, I want to select an oscillator, I don't want to build one, so I'm just using what I'm given in that sense. And if you're using what you've been given, and that's a good thing, then it sounds great, in a lot of different things. Sometimes it's not, not always perfect and not always what you want, but I would be reluctant. I say casually sometimes I like the sound of Superglider particularly. I think it has a very clean, very. When I hear it modulated, it just sounds right, particularly at a granular level. Like granular synthesis in Superglider just always seems really crisp, really well defined. And I think Marcin Petraszewski and Curtis Rhodes bear that out. Like the pulsar synthesis stuff sounds stunning, really stunning. When I've heard pulsar synthesis in Max, I'm less compelled by it, and I couldn't say why. I mean, I really couldn't. I mean, I suspect I might, it might be to do with timings and resolutions and sort of orders of executions within the program, but it's real speculation. But it's, I mean, but it's not that Max sounds bad. Max really doesn't. Like, Jesus, Oteca have made a lifetime of making music on that, and their music sounds fantastic. So it's just certain things. It just leads you to certain sounds and certain places. So yeah, Kyma just does the same. It just leads you to play with certain things because you like the sound of them, I guess. Yeah. They do all have a sound and a quality.
Yeah. It's not necessarily a question of one sounding better or of higher fidelity. Yeah. It's just that they have different identities in some aspects, and that's just the way they are. So,
yeah.
Well, so having talked about the merits of Superglider and Kyma, recently you've been turning to Max. So I was wondering if you could explain some of the motivations behind that, and having come from that Kyma background, if there are any challenges that you had to overcome to make that transition.
Just I'm on like a temporary break from Kyma at the moment, and it was more. I've always used Max. Like we got taught it on my Sonic Art course, and I've always used it ever since. And it works really nicely alongside Kyma. Max is so great for sort of particularly hardware translation or any kind of visualization. And so the main reason was to get back into Max at the moment was to explore the concatenative synthesis stuff and some of the machine learning aspects. I watched Rodrigo Constanza's FluCoMa, a couple of his FluCoMa presentations, and I really liked the ability to do real-time analysis on something and to match those with other sounds. And I was just kind of fascinated with the possibilities of real-time sort of analysis and I suppose it is a resynthesis of a sort, but a concatenative synthesis really. Readjusting to Max, like on the sound side of things, has been that's been a learning. I'm starting all the things that we talked about when we make Kyma patches at length, in terms of order of execution and about how, what you want to happen. one after the other in the DSP chain kind of came through. And so now it's about, for me with Max, it's about translating like the Kyma language down to Max. Max is much more low level, particularly when it comes to kind of gen and code box. And importantly, it can accommodate non-numerical data structures. So you can have like a bank of data, and you can process that bank of data. And like Max, I think Max just takes a little bit more work to sound crisp. But you can get there, totally get there. It just took for me a lot more time to just dig down into why am I getting clicks with that? Oh, it's that, and it's that because that's not happening at the right time. And particularly for granular stuff, because you've got windows and then you've got the source, and you've got to make sure that that all kind of lines up so that it forms one grain kind of thing, and then blowing that up. So it's much more low level, much more interesting, but and just different names for things as well. Like sometimes I'm looking for something, or oh, it's called that, and it's something completely different. But
Yeah. So you talked about Rodrigo Constanzo's work that he did for the project and off the project as well, coming to it with already his Concat synthesis patch, CCC Combine, or Combine, I believe it was called.
Yeah.
Or something. So yeah, maybe we could take a look at some more FluCoMa related concerns. So I thought a way into that could be by talking about a piece that you've already mentioned, using the EMG bracelets. So if I understand correctly, they measure muscle activity and spatial position.
Yeah.
And I know that in 2021 in Centrale, you performed that setup that connected this hardware to Kyma through a Max interface, and that you've been doing something more recently similar using the FluCoMa tools. So I was wondering if you could take us through these projects.
Yeah, sure. So I should rewind. The Mayo armbands were a lockdown revelation. Basically, I watched Atao Tanaka give a talk on Music Hackspace YouTube channel, and I was really blown away. He was using the armbands to control granular processes, oscillators, and using machine learning. I think the rapid mix object, which was a port of the Rebecca Fibrink Wekinator project, and it would learn postures, and then he would explore the space that he'd created with that, and it was fantastic. And I think so many things clicked for me. I think, like I was talking about earlier, it was performing gestural electronic music without having to be sat still or sat down. And so much of music's touch-based as well. Like every instrument is about touch, and for some reason, I think it's I responded to it not being touch-based. It felt more liberating for me. I wasn't a good type. I'm not a great typist, so live coding's like completely out, and I'm also not a keyboard player. So this felt instrumental for me, and it allows me to explore objects as well. I mean, just holding things and interacting with them, like is an avenue that I haven't really worked on. But from the start, I was like, I could hold something and I could explore the sound of the thing I'm holding just by holding it. And I did a Stein residency many years ago, and I got to play with Michael Vazovich's hands, and I've watched some YouTube videos when we were there and subsequently, and he's just that performance of being in front of people. He was live capturing sounds and transforming them, and it was mesmerizing. And so yeah, unfortunately, just as I got in, I saw Atao's thing. The armbands they'd stopped being sold, and then they stopped being supported shortly after. So luckily, I was able to get everything I needed just before that. I found some on eBay I thought I'd just try it out to start with, and just as soon as I put it on, it was like my body was a modulator. Does that make sense? It was like it really was an extension of my body in a way that was which I didn't have to think about. I could control, but not in the way that it was very different. It allowed my body to be my body without trying to force my body to be something as well. I think a lot of the work I've been is really just exploring what Atau was doing, you know, in that one project, but with Kyma as the sound source. Now I'm working and exploring sort of gesture recording and posture capture. But I think though that kind of machine learning thing is interesting. But I think I was watching Frida Aptan's talk with you the other week, and she talks about the process of mapping being very personal. And I would really agree, because when it's coming from my arms, when I'm trying to match that to something, when you get it right, it feels right. It's not just sonically, but sort of, you know, viscerally in my arm, it feels right. So yeah, I mean, the core of what I do is that the Myo object in Max takes the Bluetooth data from the armbands, spits them into Max, and they get massaged a bit, sent out to OSC into Kyma, and Max is the has been the translation layer, the visualization layer. But the recent stuff has been exploring the 3D Corpus, the FluCoMa based patch that was, I think I found on the community forum actually. And for the last performance I hacked that, and my colleague Milad Mardakeh hacked that. We hacked that together because he was working on some similar stuff, and he gave me some sounds, and we played that over some field recordings that Scott Wilson was playing. And it's not my usual palette because I'm much more into the sort of granular stuff, but it worked really nicely. And I think I also did a performance where I played, and Scott, my colleague, had built a super glider patch that did some machine listening, and it would take what I'd played and play something back based on what I played, and it was the most uncanny experience. And I think that's something I'd like to explore for myself. It was a nice improvisationary thing, and also the Myo stuff. As I said before, is I play through. I like to play through some loudspeaker setup that I've kind of designed, and you know, I played with one set with 2 hemispherical speakers and a sub, and that was really nice because it kind of emanated out and gave a bit of a spatial quality to it. I'm working with some little speakers at the moment on goosenecks, but I know also something I want to work with more is something more mobile, like a mobile setup. So these with Bluetooth speakers and stuff. So yeah, the FluCoMa tools, I think, are going to be important for that. I think the Corpus aspect has been really interesting in the way that it's just allowed me to explore sounds in a very spatial way, I think. And I think there's more things in terms of in terms of machine listening that I could do. But for now, the Corpus based stuff is what's exciting me.
Yeah. Well, it's also bearing in mind, you said earlier about having hard drives of sounds that made, and perhaps having a way to tap into these large collections of sounds, which is one of the premises for the entire FluCoMa project, which is trying to approach this question. I would like to stay on this idea of corpus and this corpus map, which is something that I find exciting, but also very. I mean, it's something. The first time I saw it was at a FluCoMa plenary when Gerard, team, he presented this 2D corpus map that he'd made in Super Collider. And so you were talking, I believe, about the 3D navigation tool that was made by Balint Laxo, who I'll actually be talking with on the next podcast, which is going to be quite interesting.
Well, thank him from me.
I will. I'll do that. So obviously it's existed for a while. There's been things like the ICAM's cat art, stuff like that. I've had experience with it. I've mainly used it for kind of as an artifact or a tool for analysis and as a way of understanding a collection of sounds. But I'm really interested in understanding how you engage with this tool in a much more aesthetic way. And I was wondering if you could talk about how one approaches a 2 or 3 dimensional space in an aesthetic or musical way.
Yeah, I think that well, the last performance we did, we used that 3D map quite extensively, and I tried. It was funny because I actually tried lots of different corpuses, just sort of working through. And I suppose to some, I know I could probably, and I should, get into the point of like really curating a corpus. I think that's the thing. But I think I quite like the unexpectedness and the exploratory nature. It's very aleatoric like that. But at the same time, for me, what's great about it is with the armbands, particularly the 3D model, I feel like I'm exploring a world of sound. I'm navigating through a world of sound. And that really resonates with me. So it almost feels like sometimes I'm like reaching out and I'm touching. Sorry, I'm trying to get this in shot. I'm reaching out and I'm touching sort of sound, and the grains are shooting out my fingers. And I think that comes from the way that the Mayo works, but also how it works in relation to exploring a corpus, to granular processes maybe. And that's, I mean, we hacked the patch a lot. I think from a performance perspective, there's a point to which sonically you get very similar material. So we hacked in some pitch transposition, some time stretching, extending the length of the grain, and we did a crazy thing and it ended up being like a enveloped pitch transposition. So each grain would kind of go up in pitch, a bit like Glisson synthesis, it would kind of just go up in pitch kind of thing. And the one thing that we'd explored, because I used Cat RT like years ago and it was a bit flaky, and my colleague Milad had used it quite extensively, and there's one thing that we haven't quite figured out, so if anyone wants to help us, please drop us a line, is getting tones. The Cat RT one, you were able to, I think it would extend the grain so that it would repeat the grain, so you could end up with sort of drones out of it. We haven't quite figured out how to do that yet, although I think there's some interesting things, but avenues. So really it was about, also it's to do with, because the patch the 3D corpus patch triggers sort of a set of like 1 or 17 or nearest grains. So you explore, you can either explore an actual point, or you can explore like a region, and you can move that. You can either move the region through, or you can move it, you know, point to point kind of thing. And that actually gives you a lot of expressive kind of control, but you end up with a lot of repeating grain kind of sound. And I think we wanted to just play with that a little bit in terms of how grains were triggered, whether they're triggered at the end of the grain cycle in his patch. But I think we broke that, and I think my armband triggers that now, so you don't get such you can control how it's triggered. So yeah, so that's quite a deep dive on onto how we used it, but I think that's how we used it, how we use that patch, and how we would explore a three-dimensional patch. And I think, I suppose as well, I mean, it's that I know Rodrigo's got another one of his YouTube videos was with a guy who tells a story, I think, with each corpus of sounds that he has. And I found that really interesting to approach corpus design as an aesthetic kind of choice. And I have been doing that, and I think we did that particularly for the last performance with the sitar sounds. And I think that definitely, it's made me think differently about how I'm going to approach what sounds I put in. But weirdly, I find too much diverse material doesn't work. It just sounds because it's always random. So yeah, there has to be some kind of what's the word? Just some kind of link in the sounds, or they have to come from some similar family of sort of tones, or have something that links them sonically. For I think for it to be fun, and to be something that can be watched as well, or listened to.
Yeah, it's an interesting activity as well. Yeah, Leafcutter John, who I'm currently writing his article about the stuff that he did for the project, talked about this activity of curating a sound world and building up a corpus that makes sense, or that where things will complement each other and things like that. It is this whole idea of corpus, and also interchanging corpora with. It also throws up questions about the kind of conceptual divide that there could be between this thing that's going to be triggering the sounds and this corpus that's going to be filling up this shell, and then navigating that, and
yeah.
People all approach these kind of balances very differently, and it's really interesting way to approach things. You talked earlier about using it was the rapid mix object, I believe it's called.
The rapid mix, rapid max,
sorry.
Yeah.
Which is a port of Rebecca Fiebrink's Workinator. I remember I saw Rebecca present at the Huddersfield Creative Coding Symposium about 4 years ago, maybe. And seeing that kind of neural net mapping for the first time, and that moment of just like, wow, that's such a powerful tool.
It is.
And this whole, and sort of, I think a lot of people always find it quite difficult. The idea of mapping basically is always something that can be quite problematic. So I was wondering if maybe you could talk about that. So I'm fascinated by this idea, and how somewhat anonymous or unmusical data could be given life through its mapping to sound, and the different ways in which this could be achieved. I'm wondering how you approach mapping. Do you have a series of gestures in mind beforehand, or is it the sound that will drive the gestures? How do you approach that whole kind of question?
I tend, the EMG data that I get off it is really noisy, and so I generally use that kind of thing for micro modulations or kind of jitter effects. And the spatial motion of the arm waving is used for kind of larger scale sort of stuff, really. And I think it's like I suppose with everything else, it's kind of an iterative process. I don't quite know what would be the starting point. I think the starting point is finding something that responds well to mostly to the micro gesture things. I use the EMG stuff also to trigger things as well, and I've got that sort of micro and sort of process, and I've got that macro process. And I think that when I'm exploring a patch, it'll be what parameters kind of work with those two scales of modulation, I guess. I mean, most of the time I'm exploring streams of grains, or, as I say, micromodulating oscillators, and it's interesting because it changes how you view, or I view, my body. I don't now just see my body as, you know, my hands or my arms or legs or whatever, but I'm a mass of electricity, and that really comes to life with these armbands. And so it's about transposing that into some kind of patch. And for me, it's all that stuff always sonically maps to sort of oscillators, you know, micromodulation of oscillator. It's a very kind of stochastic kind of sound, a very anarchist kind of sound, and also granular stuff as well. It just, I mean, literally, you plug each of those EMGs into an oscillator and listen, and it's just a bubbling, swarming mess. Do you know what I mean? And I kind of like that sound. I think the only thing, I think that there's a performative concern, and I think one of the performative concerns is if I'm not doing anything, if I'm not moving, then there's no sound. Now that's hard with the EMGs, because sometimes they'll just, but I can threshold them out, but I don't want to threshold them out so much that I lose the danger of it, or the sort of immediacy of it. So yeah, I want some of it to be readable by the audience. I mean, some of the motion, some of the things that I do are very subtle. So like you know, you can see my hand, and I'll just be a little flick of the finger, and that will trigger something, and I can feel it trigger something. But it makes for a very sort of intimate performance. And I mean, I've done some bolder stuff with sort of my arms up here or down there, but they're always bigger gestures. I also tend to make it more readable. I think I tend to like to map pitch up and down. So it's very theremin-like in that regard. But in terms of dynamics come from, it's a mixture of things, really. It's a mixture of how much tension is in my arm, how much I'm sort of straining there, and the other motions, the sort of twists and turns, come from more, they'll affect something different within the patch. I think sometimes I just look like I'm doing Tai Chi really badly. And I think I'd like to talk to a dancer maybe about movement. I mean, I'm very, a lot of the time I'm very still, although I'm still, but I can move around. So my top half is very rigid, I guess. And the movements are very, very slow and very kind of controlled. But that's really, I suppose I'm just like controlling modulation, so it's how the sound works, but the sort of the grainy stuff that's burbling on underneath gives it an energy, and then this just gives it a sort of a larger shape. So I think, yeah, my mapping is about working with those two scales of time, maybe, and motion. Well, yeah, certainly those two scales of motion, and then applying that to whatever patch I'm working with. I mean, with the 3D corpus, like one arm is navigating the 3D space, so up, down, sort of left, right, and turning and stuff. And then I think I've got a wave in motion, which is kind of, well, actually it's more that. So you have that, which is rest, and then a wave in is one motion, then a wave out is another. And I have the wave in controlling some, I think that the range of the random elements I'm controlling. And then the other arm is controlling pitch and time, pitch transposition and time stretching. So, but sometimes I'll just be, I'll be in these very contorted kind of shapes, which I quite like. I don't mind looking a bit awkward. I don't want to look beautiful, but I want to. I think if I worked with anyone, it'd be about working more with that, if that makes sense, and maybe training my body postures. My posture's just shocking anyway, so it'd be nice to work, on the posture of it. But so yeah, it's an iterative process. It's about working between those two. I think the rapid mix and the posture capture stuff, for me, I've got one Kyma patch actually that I've got too many parameters, and that's where I want to try that, because the thing is when you move parameters, sometimes there's a lump, or you wouldn't put those two parameters there at that point. So I've got to try it out. But at the moment, all my stuff's pretty much one-to-one stuff, and it's just the methodical kind of working through what works, what doesn't, changing your ranges and stuff. I need to do some nicer max programming, so that at the moment it's very dirty and low level, and like putting values in here, and it'd be nice to get one that just draw your ranges in, and that's what gets sent. I kind of had that with the Kyma patch, but yeah, since I've rebuilt, it's still in work in progress. I think it's the way. Yeah.
Yeah, it is interesting to hear you speak about how the audience are going to be perceiving that kind of thing as well, because obviously I have to mention the FluCoMa MLP regressor object as well, which is doing essentially the same kind of thing as Rebecca Fubrink's Reckonator stuff, and yeah, so some of the, for example, Sam Pluter, he used that quite heavily, mapping these chaotic synthesizers to his three-dimensional joystick. And it was very useful for him as to be able to play and create mappings, build up what I called in the article I wrote about it, these sort of corpus of mappings, corpora of mappings that he could switch between and that kind of stuff. But at the same time, he has, I suppose, the luxury of being sat behind the computer, whereas you with these bracelets are stood in front of the audience and your gestures are going to be seen. So I suppose that's a concern.
It is. I mean, it's not. I think what Atal Tanaka's done is actually he's done it in a very magical kind of way. So he'll record a posture, so he holds his posture, and then he records another posture, and there's a sense of, I think the audience can follow that, and then they can follow back where he's come, because I think he only sets a couple of postures and then moves between it, and I think that's good. I think that's really interesting, and it's definitely something I want to explore, but I think I'd like it to be, I'd like it to be readable. It doesn't have to be. I'm not hard and fast on that, but it's such a odd thing to watch somebody wave their arms around and make quite weird sounds anyway. For that to sort of bear no relation to what they're seeing is sometimes a really hard sell. I had one guy come up to me after one gig, and he was like, "So are you controlling all of that?" And I was like, "Yeah." And he goes, "But how?" And so I said, "Just put them on." So I just literally put them on him, and he started waving his arms around like this, and he was like, and it sounded awful. And he was like, "That sounds terrible. You must have learned this." And I'm like, "Yeah." Do you know what I mean? It's not. I'm not just. I have to practice. I have to rehearse a little bit. And to make it's actually a very subtle instrument. It's not, if I use the word instrument, but it's a very subtle system. It's just a very subtle assemblage. And so you've got to listen. You've got to really listen with your body and listen in the sound and with the sound, because it's exactly what John Richard's stuff is doing. You've got a kind of a semi-chaotic system which you've got to listen to and respond to, and move on in a musical way. Do you know what I mean? So you're really in that sort of loop of listening and performing, and and thinking forward and thinking, where am I now, and how am I going to make that, and then moving towards that. So it's very interesting. Now, it's not to say, I think what would be interesting with those is setting those systems up and then really flagging that up to the audience, that when I'm here, this happens. When I'm here, this happens. I like the idea. I mean, it is magic when it's like you've got a lot of parameters that you need to control and you can just do it with one or two. That's what I just was blown away by when I've seen those videos that you mentioned, and I've seen other people do. And I think it's just, I need to work it into the practice, I think.
Mm-hmm. That's great. So maybe moving on to a few broader questions. One thing I wanted to talk to you about, so I mentioned earlier that you're a big part of the Kyma community, and you even, I think you mentioned as well that you helped organise an edition of the Kyma International Sound Symposium. So obviously the building up of a community has been an important part of the FluCoMa project, be it from like a good help and tutorial structure to the creation of an environment where people feel welcome and encourage each other's creation. So coming from the FluCoMa, from the Kyma community, and having seen FluCoMa stuff, I'd just like to get some of your thoughts on the idea of community in electronic music, and perhaps by saying what's important for you in that kind of thing.
Yeah, I mean, I want to say, like, congratulations to everyone in the FluCoMa project, because it's a big undertaking, and all the tutorials and the forums and the website and have been really helpful for someone like me, sort of coming at it. I just want to pick this up and integrate this into my practice. It's been so easy, and to follow a few YouTube videos and then suddenly go, well, I can do that. I mean, sometimes it's copying, then you copy and then you hack a bit and then you go, oh, that does that, and then you get to understand things. So for me, that's really helpful. I think having starting points that are there already is massive. I mean, that was, I think, a little bit of the thing with Cat RT, was that all the objects and stuff were there, but it was all still quite low level, and you needed quite a bit of prior knowledge to sort of get going with it. So that's massive. That's really, and so thanks so much from me, and I know a bunch of my colleagues back at work as well. I think for any community, this is going to be a difficult this is a difficult, like, what makes a good community? It's a difficult kind of question, because there's what our community is and what our community could potentially be, I guess. But for me, accessibility, respect, and being welcoming is fundamental. The community, the Kyma community, but as you said, I organised the KISS conference, but I'd been to 4 before that. And I think when a community is an in-person community and an online community, it makes such a difference, and you lose all that kind of anonymous trolling, you know, because you know the person, so you can call them out, you know, and actually it doesn't really happen, so it doesn't, you know, that calling out doesn't need to happen. But so the Kyma community is good in as much that the official symbolic sound community is a little forum and a Q&A session, and this what was once a year sort of meetup of all the people that come along. But we also set up once, twice, sometimes 3, sometimes 4 weekly meetings where a group of us just get together on a Zoom call like this and work through issues, work through problems. We group build stuff. So particularly on a Tuesday evening, it's a group build evening. So we'll build a patch or we'll work on a project. And there's some really brilliant people in that community. I mean, both technically and aesthetically. And I think what's great is that everyone's covered in that community. And there's, you know, they're different people. They're from different sort of backgrounds. There's sound designers, there's musicians, there's coders, and they're all just very generous. There's dabblers, you know, people who just want to, you know, watch along and see what's going on. And everyone respects everyone else. Everyone is generous with their time and their input, and there's real respect there. And I for me, it's a wonderful place to be. The elephant in the room is gender and diversity and ethnicity, and we don't, you know, the Kyma community is not particularly diverse. That's not really good enough, but and we have a lot to learn. I mean, like Georgina Bourne, Madison Haying, who's in the Kyma community, she's written a PhD thesis on some of those aspects. I know you've at Huddersfield have got Elizabeth Dobson, who's part of the Yorkshire Women's Sound Network. There's more we can be doing, and I think a lot of it is, there's many ways to skin that cat, but we need to, you know, we need to look at the language that we're using and the discourse that we're using. And I think it's about how that discourse is shared, and it's about, as a man, as a white affluent man, it's about just listening and changing, sort of simply for me in that regard. I hope any community that shares helps people to realize their aesthetic outcomes and supports them is always a good thing, I think. So I think we mustn't lose sight of that. But yeah, I think that's it. I think it's respect, being supportive, being respectful of different people's abilities, different people's paths on the journey, allowing people to fail, allowing people to do stupid things. Yeah, that's so important. Like, it really is.
Yeah, no, I couldn't agree more. And it's interesting, that point you raised about online communities versus physical communities, because it's, yeah, I must say that, you know, if I've ever had any bad experiences in some kind of electronic music related community online, it's usually with the kind of bigger anonymous user-based kind of things, whereas with these smaller communities, and you know, we obviously had some commissioned composers and plenaries where we get together physically, but now there's also the workshops and stuff. And so yeah, we have made this effort for there to be people to know who people are, and also, you know, what I'm trying to do with the podcast as well, make introduce people to people, and you know, learning about people and stuff like that. So, yeah, no, it's really interesting.
No, I think it's massively important. It's really, I mean, like you say, I mean, it's not always can everyone kind of get together, but I mean, the things that these podcasts that you're doing, I mean, we did some performances, and then after, because we didn't, because of COVID, actually, we couldn't get together for the Kyma conference. So we just did some online. And again, it's just, that extra effort makes such a big difference.
Yeah. So talking about community, another thing I wanted to talk to you about was also your role in Beast Fest, or is it Beast Feast?
Beast Feast.
Beast Feast, sorry, yeah, because the
A
is
Feast.
It's there's a small A and the capital other letters. So I know a number of people that have performed there that have used the FluCoMa tools or are using them, be it people in the team or users. So I mean, you've already talked about it a bit, but I'd love to hear about your approach as working as a technician in this kind of event, and how you approach kind of welcoming artists in to use this kind of bespoke setup that is the Beast.
Yeah, this is the Beast. Yes, indeed. I think is the part of my job. I think one of the parts of my job that I love the most, actually, and it's sharing that group effort, because particularly with Beast, it's a Beast community. It's not that we don't have hordes of technicians that set the system up. It's I mean, maybe I don't know what, probably it's a similar thing for you, but it's PhDs and MA students and some undergrads that literally put the hours in to set the system up. It's massive. It's a massive undertaking. And so, you know, we all come together, we put the system up, and then everyone sort of scurries away again, and a few of us are left to sort of just finishing touches, and then to introduce that to whoever's come through the door. And I have to say, I mean, most of the people that come to the festival have an understanding of what we're about. I don't have to teach them, you know, why the loudspeakers are the way they are. And so it's about really just, they've got a new piece, or they've made something, and it's about what choices that are in the system are relevant to their piece, and about negotiating that, and about just supporting them, being their sounding board. I mean, Jonty's done a great job in designing that system with a lot of choices. So you can play a stereo piece, and you've got plenty of diffusion opportunities, but you can also play an ambisonic piece and have ambisonic opportunities, spatialization opportunities within that. So I mean, that's why it's so big. It's so that you've got so many choices. It's not it's really not just like about having lots of loudspeakers. It's about aesthetic choices, and also it's about, I think, for maybe some of the students who are less experienced, who play maybe play their first or second piece on the system, it's about saying, well, look, you don't need to worry about that 8 speakers or this 16 speakers. Your piece isn't about that. Just focus on, what you can do with this and with this. If it's an intimate piece, you don't need maybe big loudspeakers off to the distance, or if your piece is very big and bombastic, you're going to need them to be, where it is. And every piece has contrasts and stuff without that, but it's about, how you, I think this is the thing about time, is it's about shaping that piece through time and through in the room with the loudspeakers that you've got. It's about how that piece sort of comes to life in that room, and how you can bring it to life in that room. So it's, I guess it's I mean, diffusion itself is really difficult. Like, it's like playing the piano with all the keys jumbled up. Because every time you sit down at the diffusion desk, you're dealing with different loudspeakers in a different room, and and so you have to. It's just kind of making the right sort of choices, and I think a big part of my masters was understanding just how contingent the practice is. It's really a negotiation between the piece, the musician, the piece, the diffuser, the loudspeakers, the room, and the audience. And it's each of those has little things which need to be heard, need to be expressed, need to be manipulated. The dynamics of the piece, or the spectral elements of the piece, how they're controlled throughout, which reflects back on what the purpose of the piece was, or the aesthetic choice within the piece. I think that practice, it's not that was part of the other part of the thing, is there's nothing written down about that practice. It's nigh on impossible to do it, because it's almost a sensibility that comes from doing, and it's a very difficult thing to put down into words. I know Annette van der Gorn in Belgium has a workshop, and she does a workshop sort of every year or every couple of years, and they have a little competition. It would be nice if there was something that was more open and accessible to everyone in the UK. It'd be nice if there was something like that in the UK, because it's when we did Hear This Space and we sat people down with that, they loved it. It's a very direct, it's a very immediate kind of thing you can do, and everyone finds their own way with it as well. But it's still a very immediate practice, and it's still a very advanced practice for those that are very good at it as well. And people have very different approaches to it as well, which I find interesting.
Yeah. I suppose maybe a good way to conclude around that kind of stuff. So obviously, I think it's fair to say that the whole idea of diffusion is quite an important part of what you do in your job, when you're helping others have their pieces performed. And but one I think one aspect that we've kind of been touching on, but that we haven't really looked at directly, is how you approach diffusion of your own music and of your own setups. And I was wondering if maybe to finish, you could just discuss that.
So I mean, like with different, when we were with Hear This Space, we took a lot more of an experimental approach to diffusion, and so we would have different qualities. It was like an extension of maybe the early experiments of GRM or Borges, where they had very sort of maybe even quite visual arrangements of loudspeakers. I mean, I think Borges at one point had sort of perspective, like the loudspeakers were kind of going to a point at one point. Like today, it's much more kind of sort of circular. So when we were doing Hear This Space and we were performing work there, yes, we would try and play the room as much as possible. For me, I'm a bit of a Luddite. I like stereo diffusion. I mean, there's great 8-channel pieces, ambisonic pieces, and but I really, really like a stereo to mini system. I think it's such a nice interpretive practice. And what it makes for me is it really brings to, as I said to you before, it kind of brings to life the shape and scale and quality of a sound. So, we often talk about clouds of sound or clouds of grains, in example. But when you're in a room with lots of loudspeakers, that it takes on the size and scale of a cloud. We were testing the system back in September, and somebody had a recording of a bee, and they played the bee sound, and this bee sounded huge, like it sounded like really big. And then all of a sudden I got this moment where I felt really small. Like it was like a real Alice in Wonderland shift in perspective, just from what you're hearing. Do you know what I mean? And that's flatter on stereo. And it's like with diffusion or with multiple loudspeakers, you're stepping into that frame. And for me, loudspeakers are not transparent. They're things that they're extensions of the pieces. They're the physical manifestation of the pieces, and they bring those qualities into the room, into the place that you're listening, and into, you know, and as things as well. We forget, it's, you know, often loudspeakers are just away and we don't want to see them, and I sort of I suppose my heart's still in with the GRM, where you actually see the loudspeaker, and the speaker's almost sculptural in the way that it looks. But in terms of my practice, I think everything I do now, I think of sound as being a spatial, as being an extension of the loudspeaker. So what does this loudspeaker bring to the sound that I'm putting into it? And so that's really important. So I mean, but I know people talk a lot about, oh, I like this loudspeaker, or, you know, particularly Genelec, like ubiquitous for us. And I think you've got lots of Mayer loudspeakers, and people, you know, talk about, and rightly so, talk about, you know, frequency response, angle, you know, angle of dispersion. And these things are important. They're very much technical aspects of what we do. But sometimes that scientific, that the science of it gives it a what's the word? It gives it a grounding or a validation that it doesn't deserve. For me, it's a negotiation of that scientific quality, you know, the scientific measurable aspects, but what they can offer to a piece of music or a sound or an assemblage, you know, what they offer to the whole as well. And so, yeah, so I think with all my practice, it's, I think through the loudspeaker, I think.
Mm.
Yeah.
That's really interesting. That talking of, really struck me when you talked about that shift of perspective that you experienced. That I experienced like that myself at one gig in Electric Spring, and it really kind of made me realize that, you know, a loudspeaker setup is more than just putting sounds around you. It's really, yeah. Simon, thank you so much for that. That was really, really interesting, really fascinating. I think people have got a lot out of hearing about your practice. So I'll be putting links to everything that we've talked about today on the page where this will be living on the FluCoMa website. And so just time left to thank you so much. And
thank you very much for having me. Really appreciate it. Thanks for reaching out.
You're quite welcome. That's really, really interesting. Thanks a lot, Simon. Speak to you soon.
No problem. Bye.